Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Nourish Child Podcast. Jill here, your host, and today I have a guest with me who I think you're going to really enjoy hearing from. Her name is Julie Hess, and she is a research nutritionist at the Grand Forks Human Nutrition Research Center in Grand Forks, North Dakota. Her research, which is what we will be talking about today, is centered on identifying and evaluating strategies to help Americans meet recommendations from the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Her work involves investigating how American diets currently align with dietary guidance and recognizing and addressing barriers to following these recommendations, including dietary restrictions and dietary and cultural preferences. She's the past Vice President of Scientific Affairs for the National Dairy Council in Chicago and an active member and volunteer with several nutrition and scientific organizations. She's an adjunct assistant professor at the University of North Dakota. I met Dr. Hess last winter when I attended a conference that she presented her research at. Her research recently published in the Journal of Nutrition. I've been aware of her research findings for quite some time because she presented those to us, but they were embargoed until publication. I am delighted to be able to share her and her research with you. And my hope is that for you parents out there who worry and stress about the types of foods that you're feeding your kids, whether they're too processed or fresh enough, I know that a lot of you worry about these things. And so I've brought Dr. Hess on the podcast to really talk about what her research findings are. And we talk about ultra-processed foods and whether they are nutritious enough that you can feel comfortable feeding your kids with them. So here we go. Here is Dr. Julie Hess. Hello, Julie, and welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast.
Thank you so much, Jill. I'm happy to be here.
We're glad you are here. I know you have some important information around some of your recent research. I'm excited to unpack that for the audience here. But before we get started, would you please just tell us how you got into the field of nutrition research?
Sure. So I grew up in a big family in Dallas, Texas. I actually have 4 brothers and 4 sisters, and I never even thought about becoming a scientist. I studied English literature and French at the University of Texas at Austin, and I knew I wanted to go to graduate school, but I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. So I worked full-time for a few years at the University of Minnesota before I realized that what I was really passionate about was food. Food, eating patterns, how people make decisions about what to eat, and how nutrition plays into it. I love to cook. I love learning about food, and pursuing that academically just felt like a natural next step at that point in my life. So long story short, after taking a few years of classes to catch up on what English and French degrees don't include, like biochemistry and organic chemistry, and introductory nutrition, I completed my doctorate in human nutrition at the University of Minnesota, started my career in scientific affairs with the National Dairy Council in Chicago, and then a few years ago, I had the opportunity to move into a full-time research position with the U.S. Department of Agriculture at the Grand Forks Human Nutrition Research Center in Grand Forks, North Dakota. So now I get to spend 100% of my time dedicated to research that benefits the American people, and honestly work alongside some truly talented and dedicated folks here. Been really impressed with the workplace.
That's awesome. So we're going to talk today about processed food. We'll talk about whole foods, processed food, ultra-processed food. There's a lot of confusion around, what constitutes foods that are ultra-processed versus processed. And most parents I speak with will think of seasoned chips, cookies, colorful neon candy as processed food. Or even if they understand ultra-processed, they'll think of that Or they associate, a diet of ultra processed foods to eating everything from McDonald's for a month. We've got all kinds of sort of wacky experiments going on, but you're a true researcher and you've done the research. There is a science to food and how it's classified. So could you explain to us really the differences between whole foods, processed foods, ultra processed foods? What's the nuance there? And how do we actually classify those foods from a scientific standpoint?
That confusion about how the fields of nutrition and food science define processed foods relative to how consumers are thinking about processed foods is honestly, it's a motivating drive for my research. And it's something I think about a lot and I hear about a lot. And so right now in the nutrition science world, there's really not consensus yet for what an ultra processed food is, or even for what a processed food is. And that's true in food science as well. And part of the reason for that is that most of the foods that people buy at the grocery store have been processed in some way. So there's a reason, for instance, that the produce that you see at the grocery store isn't covered in dirt the same way it would be if you pulled it out of your backyard garden. That produce has been processed in some way. So the food classification systems that are in the process of development, really, at the food science and nutrition science research world are one way of figuring out where those lines are on the amount of processing that takes place. So how much processing is involved with the raw potato that you buy at the grocery store versus the instant mashed potatoes, as one example. And so the most commonly used system right now for determining between levels of processing is called the NOVA classification system. And that grades foods on a scale of 1 to 4, where 1 is a minimally processed or an unprocessed food. That's where your raw potato would go. 2 is a processed culinary ingredient. So that would be butter, lard, sugar, salt. 3 is a processed food. So that's had some level of processing, some combination of a group 1, a minimally processed food with a processed culinary ingredient. And then group 4 foods are largely considered foods that are industrially manufactured, have 5 or more ingredients, and then contain substances that are rarely used in home cooking. So that would probably be where you'd find an instant mashed potato.
Okay. And what would be an example of a level 3, the whole food plus the culinary ingredient?
So if you were to buy say, loaf of bread from a bakery, that would be considered a processed food. But if you buy a packaged bread at the grocery store, that's going to be considered a group 4 ultra processed food.
Okay. So the NOVA system is our current most recognized system. And when you say most recognized, certainly probably not by consumers, but in scientific research, is that?
Yes, it's the most widely used scale.
Okay. Does it have shortcomings, or, what do parents or consumers need to know about the way we classify food?
Like almost every scale that's used in a lot of research, NOVA system does have its shortcomings. And I think the fact that it doesn't account for nutrient content is one of them. So right now, that group of ultra processed foods, the group 4 foods on the NOVA scale, includes gummy bears, jarred spaghetti sauce, those Day-Glo candies you mentioned before, seasoned chips, and it also includes things like tofu and whole wheat bread. So I think it's important for consumers to know that seeing headlines about nutrition research, seeing the studies that come out, there is a whole breadth of foods that are right now fitting into that ultra processed foods category. And we're just at the early stages of kind of parsing out what that means for research and what that means for health impact.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned what you think a shortcoming is, which is the lack of focus on nutrients, because I personally, as a pediatric dietitian, have always sort of used a nutrient filter as my first lens of looking at food. Is it rich in nutrients, or is it poor in nutrients? And that's how I oftentimes coach parents around food choices, because you want to maximize nutrients as much as possible, right? Now you've done a lot of research, right, over the years, but your more recent piece of research, which I reviewed in terms of getting ready for this interview, was really looking at developing a menu using ultra processed foods to meet the dietary guidelines. Talk to us about, like, how did you even think about, doing that research, like answering that question, because it is a fascinating question. I'm not sure people are really thinking about, do the dietary guidelines actually, can you actually eat a diet that meets the dietary guidelines. I oftentimes will talk about vitamin D, for example, for children, 600 IUs of vitamin D per day. From food alone, it's really hard to meet
Absolutely.
the requirement. And so for me, that these questions percolate in my mind, obviously in your mind as well. Tell us a little bit about how you went about answering that question. Can you have a menu that meets the dietary guidelines using ultra processed foods based on that NOVA classification we just talked about? So grade 4 grade 4 foods.
So my lab's recent publication in Journal of Nutrition does show that it's possible to build a diet, a kind of a sample menu that meets recommendations from the most recent dietary guidelines for Americans while consuming most energy from ultra-processed foods, those group 4 foods in the NOVA categorization. So we did end up including foods from a range of processing levels. There are some group 1, group 2, and group 3 foods in there too. And that's partially because we wanted the menu to be realistic. So if I think about making myself a sandwich, even if it's mostly made of what would be considered ultra processed in NOVA category 4, if I'm using deli turkey and some kind of jarred sauce or packaged mayonnaise or mustard and whole wheat bread from the grocery store, I'm probably still going to want a piece of lettuce and a slice of tomato on it. But most of the calories in that sandwich are coming from the whole wheat bread and the roasted deli turkey meat. So one of the reasons that we focus on ultra-processed foods and looking at it through the lens of can you build a healthy dietary pattern that aligns with the dietary guidelines but includes mostly ultra-processed foods is, like I mentioned before, we're in these early stages of figuring out where the science is on processed foods, what the different scales mean, what it means for human health. And so in the current ongoing development of the 2025 dietary guidelines, there's a question that the scientific committee in charge of developing the basis for those guidelines is exploring. And that is, what do ultra processed foods mean in the context of dietary guidance? Is this something that public health and policy should be considering? And a lot of the impetus for my lab's work is how can we provide better scientific evidence to support the dietary guidelines? So when I saw that question come up as something to be explored in the new iteration of the dietary guidelines, I thought, well, that's something that I should know more about, for one, and that my lab should start looking into is if we think about ultra processed foods and where they are right now, one way of showing some of the work that we have to do yet is to say, okay, we can build a healthy dietary pattern that has mostly ultra processed foods, but aligns with the dietary guidelines. So what does this mean then for our next steps as a research community?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when you think about, you mentioned building a sandwich, and the whole wheat bread and the deli turkey being the ultra processed foods, what other sort of things were on the menu because you didn't do it for just one day, right? You actually took the challenge to do it for a full week, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes. We had a 7-day menu, about 2,000 calories per day, and we modeled it after the 2005 My Pyramid menu plan. That was a free USDA resource that came out in around 2005 with the My Pyramid documents. People who are up to date on the nutrition guidance and guides that are out there will know that this is not the most recent food guide out there. My Plate was created in 2010, but there's not, at the time we were working on this research, the sample menu for My Plate wasn't available online. So we used My Pyramid instead. And we ended up with menus that are almost identical to what's on the My Pyramid or My Pyramid menus. So we had meals like a breakfast burrito that has scrambled eggs and black beans and cheese, and it's served with a glass of milk and a glass of orange juice. That's one of our breakfast meals. There's a spinach pasta bake that has ricotta and spinach and tomatoes. There's a rotisserie chicken meal that's got greens and yams and peas. We've got some snacks that have vanilla yogurt, dried apricots, roasted almonds. The entire menu is available in our publication in Journal of Nutrition. That is an open access publication, so anybody anywhere should be able to access it with an internet connection.
Awesome. And I will include that link in the show notes so people can click on it pretty easily. But what I hear you're saying, and I'm sure there are parents out there listening right now going, wait, I make a spinach ricotta pasta bake and we make breakfast burritos, and I don't consider that ultra processed food. So what I hear you saying is that so much of probably what I even myself have in the refrigerator and feed my own family is classified as processed or ultra processed food, correct?
That's where we are in terms of the research right now, is there's a lot more foods than I think consumers realize, and to a certain extent, researchers realize that when you look at the NOVA classification system, end up being in that group 4 ultra processed foods, then your knee-jerk reaction for what's an ultra processed food might indicate when you really stop to look at the ingredient list.
Yeah.
There's a lot of foods that fit in there.
And a lot of foods that I would consider nutrient dense. Like I consider a whole grain bread out of a package on the grocery store shelf a nutrient rich food. I consider turkey breast from the deli a nutrient rich food. And so I feel like this could be super confusing for people because you're not really thinking, I mean, the classification system is really focused on the processing, not the nutrient density.
Right.
Kids change a lot. Their nutrition needs, eating habits, and food preferences do too. So much so, it can be hard to keep up. The Nourished Child, a website designed for parents who want more nutrition education, helps parents like you get crystal clear on raising good eaters. We've cracked the code on nourishing the whole child, whether you're raising a baby, a teen, or a child with health concerns. Our nutrition school and parent education programs help you get the inside scoop on food and nutrients, positive food parenting, and building self-motivated, autonomous kids who are good eaters. Visit thenourishedchild.com today.
There is not a consideration for nutrient density in that scale right now.
So that's a big point of confusion, I would think, for a lot of people.
The research is really in early stages right now. There's a long ways to go. And I think that particular point tends to get lost in some of the communications about what's happening in the research world vis-a-vis processed foods right now.
Yeah. Are there other class 4 ultra processed foods that parents might be surprised to know?
Not working with parents often myself, I'm not sure how to comment on that. I will say that many folks that I talk to seem surprised by just the pure breadth of foods that end up being considered ultra processed. So we talked about whole grain breads, deli meats, a lot of jarred sauces, flavored yogurts.
Mm-hmm. Probably processed, or probably cheese, right?
There are some cheeses that are considered group 4. One of the challenges with the NOVA classification scale, though, too, that we learned while we were working on developing this dietary guidelines adherent menu is that sometimes it's very hard to tell which group a food will fit into. So one of the things we did with our study to make it as strong as possible, because we knew there was some confusion about what group foods would fit into, is we actually had external experts in NOVA independently grade all of the foods that we included in our menu. So it wasn't people in my lab saying, well, we think this is a group 4 food, so we should have it in the menu. We actually sent them off, took off all the branding information, and just included the generic name of the food and the food ingredient list, and told our experts, please grade this for us so that we're not the ones figuring out where it fits, and you can tell us where it should fit. And I was surprised at how difficult it was, even for people who had some kind of expertise in NOVA, to categorize foods. So even what I'm saying in this interview about class 4 foods, other people might disagree with me. They might say, well, there's canned beans that aren't ultra processed foods. And yes, that's true. It's so dependent on what brand you're looking at, what the ingredient deck looks like. The research just has a long ways to go.
Yeah. So I'm curious, with your study, your 7-day menu plan based on class 4 NOVA scale foods, how did it stand up when you compared it to the dietary guidelines for Americans?
It was actually pretty close to a dietary guidelines recommended dietary pattern in many respects. We had just over 2,000 calories. Our goal was 2,000 calories per day. We had adequate amounts of all macronutrients. So we had carbohydrates, protein, fat. We also had amounts of saturated fat and added sugars that were within the limits recommended in the dietary guidelines. We also had adequate amounts of pretty much all micronutrients, except for, like you mentioned, vitamin D, which is very difficult to get enough of from food. Vitamin E and choline were also a little bit low, but dietary guidelines patterns are all low in vitamin E and choline too. The diet quality score was pretty high for our dietary pattern for our menu as well. We had a score of 86 out of 100, where 100 is perfect compliance with the dietary guidelines. So the two areas where this menu really lagged behind were sodium and the amount of whole grains. So we didn't have quite enough whole grains to meet the recommendations in the dietary guidelines, and we had more sodium even than what Americans typically consume. So the recommendations for sodium is 2,300 milligrams per day. Most Americans consume 3,400 milligrams per day, and our menu, I think, had 4,100 milligrams per day.
Okay.
But with those caveats, it was fairly close to a dietary guidelines eating pattern.
And that makes sense with the sodium to me, because a lot of processing will use salt as sort of a preservative in some of the food items. So it sort of makes sense to me.
Right. And we also didn't go back and edit the menu to try to make it better. We took our first pass at, these are category 4 foods, according to experts. This fits into the My Pyramid menu, and then we went from there. We didn't try to add any extra whole grains. We didn't try to cut the sodium. But I think if we had gone back and tried to improve it, I really think we could have, certainly with the whole grains.
Sure. Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that a diet based on ultra-processed foods, namely the grade 4 classification foods from NOVA, can be nutritious, can meet the dietary guidelines.
Yes, with attention for the nutrient density of those foods.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's another sort of a side question. Oftentimes, I know professionally myself, I'm getting away from the term healthy because, when I think about, can a diet of ultra processed foods be healthy? Well, we don't know, right? You even said earlier at the top of this interview, that's an area of research we don't know if it's healthy, but it does sound like it can be nutritious. And I think that's a fine point, I think, for parents to hear, because nutritious and healthy can be two different things, right? We assume that if it's nutritious, it is healthy, but we don't have evidence necessarily to prove something's healthy for your body, even though it is nutritious. I guess we're splitting hairs. I'm splitting hairs a little bit, but.
Yes, I see your point though. And that's very true. And I think that's why we've got this movement in nutrition research right now for precision nutrition, because what's healthy for my body may not be healthy for your body too.
Exactly.
Even if the food is nutritious, if you look at it objectively from how many nutrients it has.
Yes. Yes. And so what do we need to know about ultra processed food consumption and health? What are sort of the missing pieces of information that researchers can be looking at in the future, or maybe looking at?
I think what I hope to see from research coming out on ultra processed foods is more attention to just the range of foods that are currently fitting into in the category of ultra processed on NOVA, how to further parse out perhaps the nutrient dense ultra processed foods from the less nutrient dense ultra processed foods, and then some more intervention studies. So to date, to my knowledge, there's only been one study that actually fed people a diet of ultra processed foods and a diet of unprocessed foods. And a lot of the other research, although we hear about research on ultra processed foods all the time, a lot of it is based on pre-existing data sets. So that means that the researchers had to make some assumptions about which products people report eating would be considered ultra processed foods, less processed foods. So I think we need more intervention studies where people are actually eating these diets and researchers are measuring the health outcomes to keep moving this field forward.
Yeah. Yeah. So how will you answer the question for the 2025 dietary guidelines?
I'm curious to see how that nets out. The next committee meeting is September 12th and 13th. I will certainly be tuning in and listening to their discussion. And it depends on what they find in their literature review and what they decide to include in their evidence review.
Yeah. Hopefully your work will be part of that.
We will see.
Yeah. Yeah. What are your thoughts? Because, a 2000 calorie diet really is more of an adult based caloric level, or perhaps even, for some of the older teenagers. What are your thoughts around how this affects or may be applied to children? I mean, is that a research line in the future, or what can we glean, or what can we take from this for children, US children?
Well, I think in terms of, if we think about DGA dietary patterns, even though the energy levels are different, the nutrient levels are a little bit different, the foods that we'd be in the whole grains group for adults are still in the whole grains group for kids, same fruits and vegetables, same protein foods. So there's still a lot of those ultra processed foods that we identified in our study that would be appropriate choices for, say, whole grains for kids, or vegetables for kids, or protein foods for kids. So I think at this point, what we've been talking about kind of for the past couple minutes is that it's the nutrient density of the diet overall that's most important. And whether that includes ultra processed foods or not, for a healthy diet overall, for a nutritious diet, it's more important to look at nutrient density until we can get more of a handle on what's happening in processed foods and what that means.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a good way to go. I just have finished up a book that I wrote that'll come out next summer. And my editor said, "You've written so many books about food. You need to write this one particular chapter in a different way. Like, it can't sound like the other things that you've written." I'm like, "Oh, there's food groups." It's like really hard to get creative. And, I settled in with like minimally nutritious, decently nutritious, and highly nutritious, because I was like, how can I make this simple and easy? I've always it's all about the nutrients. Like, if something is in a bag versus pulled out of the garden, to me, that's less important than the nutrient density. To me, that's particularly for children. That's where it's really sort of very important, I think. But it's not easy to talk about food.
No.
It's not easy to simplify food either.
No.
One of the things that struck me about your research and just this whole topic about ultra processed food is that we have such economic diversity in our country that it's somewhat refreshing to be able, if you're a parent out there who is working with a food budget, who has, time constraints and budget constraints, it's refreshing to hear that you can nourish your children and your family on foods that may be more affordable. And some of the ultra processed foods may be more affordable for families than the message that we often hear, which is go to Whole Foods, or, only eat fresh fruits and vegetables, only eat, meats and dairy from the farm. And, this demonization of processing or processed food can be very alienating for families who are budget concerned, or budget constrained rather. Do you have any thoughts
Absolutely.
about that?
It's actually a great segue, so thank you. I know you had wanted to chat a little bit about what my lab is looking into next. And
Yes.
every time I talk about this ultra processed food work that we've done and how ultra processed foods can fit into healthy dietary patterns with their current definition, I seem to always get the questions, does using ultra processed foods save time and money? And I realize that hasn't really been touched on in the literature right now. So that is something that my lab's exploring right now. If we make a diet that has mostly unprocessed foods versus mostly ultra processed foods, what's the time savings difference? And what's the financial savings potentially between those two dietary patterns? So I'm surprised that this research is in the early stages that it is right now, but we are working on that. And I personally like to do research that's highly applied. And to me, this
Yeah.
is an important question, because
Sure.
real people out there are eating real foods and making decisions every day. What's informing those decisions may be different from what the research community thinks should be informing those decisions. So I want to look at, okay, let's let's think about what is actually influencing most consumers' decisions about what to buy. It's taste and its convenience and its
Mm-hmm.
price. So how
Mm-hmm.
can we look at those things with a scientific lens, with a research lens, and see where can we find the intersections? So that's what my lab's looking into next.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And I think taste, when it comes to children, it's taste and appearance are the two leading factors around why children eat what they do. It's got to taste good and it's got to look good. If it doesn't look good, they're not interested. If it doesn't taste good, they're not tasting it again. Right. And so that's another, I think, important question, because parents really do buy or purchase food based on what they know their family will eat, because nobody wants to waste their time or their effort or their money.
Right.
So that's another sort of practical question that I'm always curious about. I mean, we have some research around why parents buy what they buy, and it's largely influenced by their children's taste preferences, food preferences. But I wonder how taste factors into it as well. Taste, convenience, financial affordability, and then also just like the societal aspects of everything, food shaming and what's popular and what diet is popular. And that affects a lot of what people go out and buy also.
Oh, absolutely.
So, well, it's awesome to hear that you're doing this research, and I thank you so much for doing it. What is it that you would like parents to know as we close out this interview?
We've talked about this some, and I know I hear this from all kinds of folks that I talk to about ultra-processed foods, and you started the interview with this too, there's a lot of fear about
Mm-hmm.
ultra-processed foods and making sure that you feed your families in a healthful and supportive way. And with where the research is right now in ultra-processed foods, there's a lot of nutrient-dense choices out there that may have a few more ingredients in them that are still perfectly healthy and safe choices. And so that's what I'd like to leave with, is not to be afraid of foods that are labeled ultra processed if
That's
they're nutrient
awesome.
dense.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for that, because I think that is calming for parents to hear. So where can listeners find you and find more of your work?
The Grand Forks Human Nutrition Research Center, I know that's kind of a mouthful, GFHNRC. Our website has a running list of the latest publications from my lab and from the other labs at our center. We also have a Twitter account at GFHNRC, and listeners can always reach out to me via email as well. If they have any specific questions or want copies of my papers, I'm happy to share. Most of those are available open access to.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being on The Nourished Child. And it's lovely to talk to you. And I will watch your information flow, your research flow from you. It's great to have met you back in January and see this come to fruition.
Yes, likewise. Thank you for helping me get the information out there so that it could be helpful to people.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.